She said it like it was nothing, like it was easy to throw away years of love. "I'll say you're dead." He could feel the weight of her words sinking in, but something else stirred beneath the shock. Anger. The kind of raw, desperate fury that only comes when everything you've built is ripped apart. He didn't beg her. He didn't cry. He simply stood there, a broken man in her eyes. But in his heart, he was already building something new. The game was about to change. They thought he was done, but he hadn't even begun. James Walker had always been a man of ambition. There was something in the air of New York City that fueled his drive, a pulse that kept him moving faster than the trains rumbling beneath the streets. At 29, he already had the world at his feet. His tech startup, the one that had started in a cramped apartment on the Lower East Side, was now a growing company, earning its place among the elites of Silicon Alley. He had the apartment, the car, the sharp suits that gleamed under the city lights, and, most importantly, he had Emma. She was everything he had ever imagined in a partner. Confident, radiant, and just as driven as he was. Emma Reed, PR manager at a high-powered firm, had the kind of beauty that stopped conversations. Tall, blonde, with an unshakable poise, she moved in circles where only the best were invited. She was the face of New York's glitzy upper crust, a woman who not only caught the eye but held attention effortlessly. Their first date was at a rooftop bar overlooking the city skyline, the lights casting an electric glow over the scene. "You know," Emma said, swirling her drink in one hand as she studied him through eyes sharp and calculating, "I don't normally go for the tech type. Too much startup buzz and not enough substance." She leaned forward, her lips curling into a smile. "But you seem different." James, ever the charmer, leaned back, feeling that familiar rush of pride. "Different how?" he asked, his voice low and confident. "I don't know," she said, tapping her glass. "I can tell when someone has real potential. And you do. It's in your eyes." She paused, her smile growing. "I'm not the kind of woman who dates anyone without potential." Her words stuck with him like a needle, and for the next few months, they were inseparable. Together, they were a power couple, at least in the eyes of those around them. Emma's social media posts were filled with James' smiling face, his grind harder attitude a perfect match for her polished public persona. Every dinner, every event they attended was a subtle competition of who could outshine the other, who could make the most lasting impression. The first year was a whirlwind of successes. James' company hit milestones he'd only dreamed of. He signed contracts with international clients. His stock options soared, and investors couldn't get enough of his product. Emma, too, was climbing the corporate ladder, her face now appearing in magazines and her name whispered with respect among the city's elite. But as their successes built walls around them, the cracks started to form. James sat in his office one evening, his fingers tapping on the desk, trying to silence the ringing of his phone. It was another investor, eager to pour money into his business. But something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him, inside his business, was beginning to fray at the edges. The constant grind was wearing him down. His success had brought him everything, but now, it felt like everything was slipping away. The pressure was mounting, and for the first time, he wondered if it was all worth it. Emma called him later that night. Her voice was cheerful, as always, but there was an edge to it. "Hey, babe, we need to talk," she said, sounding like she was walking through one of the many luxury boutiques that dotted the Upper East Side. "I know you've been busy, but I think it's time for us to talk about us." James frowned, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing against his chest. But he pushed it down. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile into his voice. "Let's talk." As he stared out the window at the city lights, a sense of unease washed over him. He knew, deep down, that everything was about to change. The first signs of trouble came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping up behind them. James had always been able to sense shifts in the air, in the pulse of the city, but nothing prepared him for the global storm that would upend everything. The pandemic was like a chokehold on everything he had built. The world slowed down, cities locked down, and the tech industry, his industry, was hit harder than most. At first, it seemed temporary. A brief dip, a blip in the otherwise bright trajectory of his startup. The first few weeks were filled with uncertainty, but James held on to the belief that things would bounce back. Investors remained hopeful, and the meetings, though virtual now, continued. But the cracks deepened. James could feel it in his gut, a creeping sense of dread that his business was no longer insulated from the chaos. Clients started backing out of contracts, unable to justify tech investments during a time of crisis. Corporate meetings turned into conference calls, which turned into empty promises. It was the death of the new economy as they knew it. Emma, on the other hand, was unfazed. Her firm had adapted quickly, shifting to virtual PR and securing partnerships with other large corporations that made her job secure. She'd taken to the changes like a fish to water, carving out her niche even in uncertain times. She stayed busy, always on the move, her Instagram photos showing glamorous shots from her home office, her perfectly curated outfits contrasting sharply with the bare, muted backgrounds of her Zoom calls. James, however, felt like he was suffocating. "James, you need to wake up." Emma's voice echoed through the phone one evening, sharp with impatience. "You're sitting here like a deer in headlights while the rest of us are adjusting. You can't just hope this passes. You need a plan." He sat on the edge of the couch, his laptop open in front of him, another meeting canceled for the second time this week. His hand ran through his hair, frustration simmering under the surface. He'd been so sure of his success, of his vision, and now it was crumbling right in front of him. "I'm working on it," he muttered, but it felt like the words were empty. He had nothing concrete, no solid way forward. "You've been saying that for months, James," she snapped. "I can't keep living like this. I don't know what you're waiting for." Her words felt like an accusation, but more than that, they felt like a verdict. There was a distance in her voice now, a coolness that hadn't been there before. The man who had once been her rock, her vision of future success, was now a shadow of himself. It wasn't just the business that was crumbling. It was everything. That night, as James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the situation felt unbearable. He had nothing to show for the sleepless nights and relentless work. He was a failure, not just in his business, but in his relationship. Emma's cold words stung more than any failure ever could. He had always been the one to provide, to protect, to give her the life she deserved. And now? Now he was nothing. The man she had built her dreams on was no longer the man she wanted by her side. And that thought burned worse than any loss in his career. The pressure began to take its toll on James in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the sinking business or the frustration of watching his dreams slip through his fingers. It was the sense of being trapped in a life he no longer recognized, a life that seemed to be moving forward without him, leaving him behind. He still made the calls, still pitched ideas to anyone who would listen, but they were all falling flat. There was nothing to offer anymore. No next big thing that would make investors salivate. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and each night, Emma's cold silence was the only thing waiting for him when he got home. It was a Wednesday when it happened. James had been on yet another hopeless call with a potential investor, a call that ended in nothing but empty promises. He was so tired, so damn tired. He hung up the phone with a sigh, leaning back in his chair, his eyes closing. But just as he was about to let himself drift into a brief moment of peace, the door slammed open. Emma walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like they were meant to punctuate each step. Her gaze was steely, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. James didn't even look up. "We need to talk," she said, her tone sharp, as if her patience had finally snapped. James exhaled, rolling his neck to try and loosen the tension that had built up there. "Not now, Emma. I can't do this right now. I'm exhausted." "No," she insisted, her voice unwavering. "You're going to listen to me now. I'm done with this. This, whatever this is." He looked up, finally meeting her gaze. The woman he once thought he could build an empire with now seemed like a stranger to him. Her face was cold, her expression unreadable. "Done with what, Emma?" James replied, his voice quieter than he intended, the weight of the conversation already bearing down on him. "You think I'm not trying? You think I'm just sitting around doing nothing? You're not trying hard enough, James." She shook her head, a slight sneer forming on her lips. "I'm tired of watching you waste away, trying to fix something that's broken beyond repair. You're supposed to be the man in this relationship. But instead, I'm carrying all of this. I've been picking up the slack for months now." His chest tightened. "What are you saying, Emma?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She took a step closer, lowering her voice, but with a finality that cut through him like a blade. "I'm saying that I can't be with someone who isn't pulling his weight. I can't be with someone who's still living in the past, holding on to a dream that's never going to come true." The words landed with brutal precision. It wasn't the first time she had expressed her frustration, but the way she said it, the coldness, the detachment, hit him harder than he ever expected. "You're serious?" James asked, the question hanging in the air, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm serious," she said, her tone resolute. "I've waited long enough. I deserve more than this." James stood up suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He had no words left. The sense of betrayal was suffocating, but what hurt the most was the realization that Emma, the woman he thought he would spend the rest of his life with, had already made up her mind. He didn't argue. He didn't fight back. He simply walked away, grabbed his jacket, and left. The door slammed shut behind him with the finality of 1,000 decisions made before him. James wandered the streets of Manhattan like a ghost. The city, once a place that pulsed with promise and excitement, now felt suffocating, the towering skyscrapers looming like silent, indifferent giants. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, the weight of failure pressing down on him with every breath. The divorce papers had come earlier that day. The envelope was thick, cold to the touch, and when he ripped it open, the words inside were like a cruel echo of everything that had gone wrong in his life. The sentence that lingered in his mind like a poison was simple: "For the best of both parties." She had signed it without hesitation. No arguments, no fights, just the finality of her departure. James found himself walking aimlessly, the bustling noise of the city blending into a distant hum. He felt disconnected from everything, like he was floating above it all, watching his life crumble from a place he couldn't reach. He had built everything with his own hands, but it had all been for nothing. The house, the car, the business, they meant nothing now. It was all gone. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a faint sound amidst the city noise. It was a message from his old business partner. "I have some leads for you. It's not too late." James stopped in his tracks, staring at the message as if it held the answer to everything. But the truth was, nothing felt real anymore. Nothing felt worth it. His hands shook slightly as he tucked the phone back into his pocket. He spent the night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, the walls thin, the air heavy with the smell of old cigarettes. The room was dimly lit, the yellow light from the overhead bulb flickering. James lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, as thoughts of Emma and the past few months swirled in his mind. The silence of the room pressed in on him, suffocating him in a way he hadn't expected. "I should have fought harder," he muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. Fighting against what? His own failures? His inability to live up to her expectations? The night dragged on, every minute stretching into an eternity. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. He could still hear her words in his mind, could still feel the weight of her betrayal. She had moved on, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of a life he no longer recognized. The days blurred together in the motel room. James found himself stuck in a cycle of aimlessness, trying to piece together a plan for his future, but unable to focus. The walls seemed to close in on him, each passing day echoing with the hollow sound of his own thoughts. Yet, in the midst of this despair, something inside him began to stir, a flicker of hope, a quiet but insistent voice urging him to take action, to stop sinking into the darkness. One afternoon, while nursing a cheap cup of coffee in a diner, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his old colleague, Kyle. The message was short and to the point. "I think I might have something for you. Let's meet." Kyle had been with James from the very beginning, back when the startup was just a wild idea and the days were spent hustling to make it a reality. Kyle had stuck by his side through thick and thin, and while their paths had diverged in the chaos of their businesses, James had always trusted him. The message was a lifeline, a thread to pull him out of the abyss. They met later that evening at a small, nondescript bar in Brooklyn, the kind of place where people came to forget their problems and pretend the world hadn't changed. Kyle looked different, older, his face marked with the same lines that James had noticed in his own reflection. But there was something else in his eyes, a spark, the kind that James hadn't seen in months. "I've been watching what you've been doing, James," Kyle said as they sat down at a corner booth, the dim light casting long shadows over their faces. "I know it's been tough, but you've got something no one else has, that fire. You just need to refocus." James felt a mix of gratitude and frustration. Refocus? It's hard to even know where to start. Kyle nodded, leaning in. "I know, but I've been working on a project. Something I think could really work. It's not some big flashy tech thing, but it's got legs. I need a partner, someone who knows how to build something from nothing. I'm thinking you could be that person." James stared at him, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Kyle was offering him a chance to rebuild, but it wasn't going to be easy. The new venture wasn't a quick fix or a get-rich-quick scheme. It was something that required trust, patience, and, most importantly, belief in the long game. "You're serious?" James asked, his voice hoarse. "Dead serious," Kyle replied. "I've already got a couple of investors on board. We can start small and scale up, but we'll need to work hard, really hard. This is going to be a grind, But you've done it before, haven't you? James took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was the chance he needed. The opportunity to start fresh, to build something that wasn't tied to his past failures. He had nothing left to lose, and maybe, just maybe, he could finally prove to himself that he was more than the man Emma had discarded. "All right," James said, the words coming with a newfound resolve. "Let's do it." Kyle grinned, his eyes lighting up. "That's the spirit. Let's get to work." As they discussed the details of the project, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: excitement. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he believed that he might just be able to rebuild his life. The weeks that followed were a blur of late nights and early mornings, the kind of relentless grind that James had once thrived on. Kyle's project, though modest, had potential. It wasn't the flashy, high-tech startup James had once dreamed of, but it was grounded in something real. A service platform designed to help small businesses navigate the post-pandemic economy. Practical, functional, and essential in the new world that was slowly taking shape. James threw himself into the work, his hands no longer shaking with doubt, but steady with determination. They worked from the ground up, drafting business plans, building connections, and reaching out to local businesses who might benefit from their service. It was slow at first, but the momentum began to build. With every small win, a new partnership, a client signing on, James felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in months. Emma, meanwhile, continued to thrive in her own world. She was still climbing the corporate ladder, still attending exclusive events, and networking with the city's elite. James hadn't seen her since their breakup, and though part of him longed for the life they once had, he knew he was better off without it. His success, or lack thereof, had always been tied to her validation. Now, he was finding it within himself. It was freeing, in a way, to realize that his worth wasn't defined by her. One evening, after a long day of meetings, James sat alone in his small office, watching the sunset paint the skyline in shades of gold and purple. He could hear the distant hum of the city below, the constant rhythm of life moving around him. He had built this from the ground up, not just the business, but himself. His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. A message from Kyle. "We've got a big meeting tomorrow. Investors are interested." James felt a surge of excitement. It was the moment they had been waiting for. The chance to prove that their project was more than just an idea, that it could succeed where so many others had failed. The next morning, they sat in a sleek conference room, their presentation ready. The investors, a group of sharp-suited men and women, eyed them skeptically as they presented their vision. But James wasn't nervous this time. He spoke confidently, his passion for the project evident in his voice. He was no longer just a man trying to scrape by. He was a man who believed in what he was building, who knew that this project was just the beginning. The meeting ended with a handshake. They had the investment they needed to take the business to the next level. James sat back, his heart racing. This was it, his second chance. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Later that evening, as he walked down the streets of Manhattan, the weight that had once consumed him began to lift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The city that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like home. The possibilities stretched out before him, endless and bright. As the lights of the skyline twinkled above him, James smiled. He had come a long way from the man who had walked out of his apartment, broken and lost. But now he was building something real. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. It didn't take long for James to realize that the road to success wasn't as smooth as he had imagined. The investment from the investors had provided a much-needed boost, but now the real challenge began. The pressure was mounting, and it wasn't just coming from the market or competition. It was the internal pressure, the constant drive to prove to himself that he was worthy of this second chance. The business was growing, yes, but it was also fragile. The new platform was helping small businesses, but getting people to trust it, to make the switch from their old, reliable systems to something new, was proving to be harder than they had anticipated. James and Kyle spent long hours tweaking the product, making it better, more intuitive, more accessible. Yet, for every new client they gained, another would hesitate or back out. One particularly frustrating afternoon, after a long and tiring meeting with a potential client who had decided to go with a competitor, James found himself in a small, dimly lit cafe, nursing a coffee that had long gone cold. He stared at the empty mug, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. What was he doing wrong? Where was the magic that had once made his startup soar? On the bright side, we've got a few new leads. Kyle's voice broke through the haze of frustration, pulling him back to the present. Kyle had that way of looking on the positive side of things, even when things were bleak. But James wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the optimism. "I don't know, Kyle," James muttered, pushing the mug away. "I feel like we're running in circles. I thought we'd be further along by now. People still don't seem to care, and I don't get it. Why aren't they getting it?" Kyle sat across from him, his eyes thoughtful. "It's tough, but we've got to keep pushing. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will this be. We're building something people need, James. It takes time for people to realize it." James didn't respond immediately. Kyle's words were comforting, but they felt like a blanket over a wound that hadn't quite healed. The struggle was real, and despite all the progress, he couldn't shake the feeling of being on the edge of failure once again. As the day wore on, the stress of the situation gnawed at him. The weight of expectations, his own and those of his investors, was starting to feel suffocating. He was no longer the man with the world at his feet, the go-getter who took risks and succeeded. He was becoming a man running from the ghosts of his past failures, trying desperately to outrun the doubts that plagued him. But there was no turning back now. He had chosen this path. There was no way but forward. And so, with a sigh, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed the number of a potential partner he'd been trying to reach for weeks. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. James Walker. The voice on the other end was deep and professional. "I've been hearing good things about your platform. Let's talk." For the first time in days, a spark of hope ignited in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was the break they had been waiting for. James woke up to an unfamiliar sense of purpose. The phone call from the potential partner had opened up a new avenue, and as he sat in his small office, staring at his computer screen, he felt an electric charge in the air, the kind that only comes when something is about to change. The meeting had been scheduled for the following day, and for the first time in a while, James wasn't dreading it. In fact, he was ready for it. He had something to prove, not just to his investors or to his competitors, but to himself. The air outside was crisp, the city streets bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon. As James made his way to the conference room, he couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting could be the turning point, the one that would set everything in motion. The office building was sleek, modern, and intimidating. As he entered the lobby, the polished marble floors gleamed, and the sound of clicking heels echoed in the quiet space. The receptionist greeted him with a smile, and pointed him toward the elevator. James stepped inside, pressing the button for the 38th floor, his mind racing with 1,000 possibilities. What would this partnership mean? What if this was the moment they had been waiting for? When he arrived, he was greeted by a group of investors, each one sharp-eyed and well-dressed, sitting around a glass conference table. At the head of the table sat Lucas Green, the CEO of a major consulting firm, known for taking chances on underdogs. His reputation had been built on turning small startups into global players. Lucas wasn't the type to settle for mediocrity, and the fact that he was interested in James' platform made James feel, for the first time in months, that he might be onto something real. "Mr. Walker," Lucas said as they shook hands, "I've heard great things about your platform. Let's see if we can take it to the next level." James took a deep breath, his nerves settling as he began to speak. The presentation had been fine-tuned to perfection, each slide carefully crafted to show the strengths of their service and its potential for growth. The room fell silent as James outlined their vision, his voice confident and steady. The words flowed, and for once, he wasn't just reading from notes. He was speaking from a place of passion, from the heart of everything he had built. He could feel the eyes of the investors on him, not just seeing a man struggling to stay afloat, but a man who had figured out the next big thing. After a tense pause, Lucas leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "You've got something here, Walker. This could be big. I think we can work together. But it's going to take more than what you've got now. We need to scale fast, or we'll lose the opportunity." James didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. Whatever it takes." The investors exchanged glances, and the weight of their approval settled over him like a wave. This was it, the moment he had worked so hard for. The deal wasn't finalized yet, but it was close. James left the meeting feeling lighter than he had in months. For the first time, he believed it. This could be the breakthrough he had been waiting for. As he walked out of the building, the city no longer felt like an obstacle. It felt like a place where dreams could come true. He had made it this far, and now, with the right support, he could finally push his business to the top. The weeks following the meeting with Lucas Green felt like a blur. The deal had been sealed, a partnership that would allow James and his team to take their platform to new heights. But with the triumph came new pressure. The expectations were higher now, and there was no room for failure. Every decision had to be calculated, every step forward measured. James dove back into work with an intensity he hadn't felt in a long time. He spent long hours refining the product, working with his developers, and reaching out to new clients. Kyle was by his side every step of the way, handling the operations side of the business, making sure everything ran smoothly. Together, they made a great team, and the progress was undeniable. But it wasn't just about the business anymore. The deal with Lucas had elevated James' profile in the business world. Soon, he was being invited to speak at industry conferences, to sit on panels, and to meet with other influential players in the tech world. One such invitation came from a prestigious event in Silicon Valley, a chance to speak about their platform's potential and the future of small business tech. The morning of the event, James stood in front of a massive auditorium, the bright lights of the stage illuminating his face. The crowd buzzed with excitement, their eyes fixed on the stage. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when he would show the world that he wasn't just the guy who had stumbled through failure. He was the man who had figured it out, who had turned everything around. The applause as he walked onto the stage was deafening. James took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone, and smiled. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "It's an honor to be here with all of you today. A few years ago, I was standing on the edge of failure, trying to figure out what to do next. But here I am, speaking to all of you, because I refuse to give up." The words flowed from him effortlessly. He spoke about the challenges he had faced, the doubts that had threatened to consume him, and the people who had helped him get back on his feet. He spoke with a passion and confidence that he had never felt before. The audience hung on every word, the room silent except for his voice. As he finished his speech, the applause was overwhelming. James stood there, feeling the weight of his journey settle over him. He had made it. He had risen from the ashes of his failure to stand in front of these people, to show them what he was capable of. Later that evening, as he mingled with other speakers and attendees at the after-party, James felt a sense of pride that he hadn't felt in years. The business was on its way to becoming a success, and his reputation had been solidified in the industry. He was no longer the struggling entrepreneur, the man trying to find his place. He was James Walker, a leader, a visionary, and a man who had proven his worth. As the night came to a close, James stepped outside into the cool air. The city lights shone brightly around him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he truly belonged here. He had fought for this moment, and now it was his. But as he stood there, looking up at the stars above the city, something inside him stirred. He had done it, but there was still more to come. And this time, he was ready for whatever the future held. James woke up the next morning with a sense of calm that had eluded him for months. The world outside his window was still bustling, the city as vibrant as ever, but for the first time, he felt a quiet peace settle inside of him. The weight of the past was lifting piece by piece. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it no longer held him captive. He had done what he set out to do, not just with the business, but with his own life. He had rebuilt himself, found his purpose again, and now it was time to focus on the next chapter. As he made his way into the office, the team greeted him with smiles and congratulations. The recent success had put them on the map, and the momentum was undeniable. Kyle was in a meeting with the developers, fine-tuning some final features of the platform, while other team members were busy with calls and emails. It felt good. The energy was high, the company was growing, and James felt like he was finally in control. Yet, amid all the excitement, a quiet, nagging feeling lingered. It wasn't doubt. It wasn't fear of failure. It was something else, something deeper. Emma had been absent from his thoughts for the most part, but as the business took off, a strange curiosity crept in. How was she? Had she seen his speech at the conference? Had she been following his success? These thoughts swirled in his mind more often than he cared to admit. He pushed them away. He had made his peace with their relationship, or at least he thought he had. Yet, as much as he tried to ignore it, he knew that the old wounds would not heal completely until he had closure. Later that afternoon, as James sat in his office reviewing some financial reports, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "James," the message began, the words striking him like a sudden shock. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Can we meet?" It was Emma. James hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen, his mind racing. What did she want? Why now, after all this time? He had no answer, but his curiosity got the better of him. He responded, agreeing to meet her at a quiet cafe later that evening. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, James walked to the cafe, the familiar streets of the city feeling strangely distant. He had changed, and he wondered if Emma would even recognize the man he had become. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table, her face slightly flushed, as if she had been waiting for a long time. There was something different about her, too, a weariness in her eyes, a vulnerability that wasn't there before. "James," she said softly as he sat down, "I didn't know if I should reach out. I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking about you." James studied her carefully, the woman he once thought he knew completely. She was still beautiful, still polished, but there was a weight in her gaze that told him she wasn't the same person she had been when they first met. "I'm listening," James replied, his voice steady but guarded. He wasn't sure what she wanted, but he was done being the man who would bend to her every whim. I've been wrong," she said, her voice shaky. "I treated you terribly, James. I know that now. I was so caught up in my own world, in my own success, that I couldn't see how much you were hurting. I thought I could just walk away from it all. But I can't. Not anymore." James felt a flicker of something in his chest. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was something else. He wasn't sure. "You've hurt me, Emma," he said, his voice quieter now, but firm. "I needed you, and you chose to walk away. You didn't see me, you didn't see what we had. And now, after all of this, why are you here?" She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. I just want to say I'm sorry. I want you to know that I regret everything. And I miss you. I miss us." James leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The past was alive in this moment, and he could feel it pulling him back. But he refused to let it. "I can't be that person anymore," he said quietly. "I've moved on, Emma. I've built something real. And I'm finally starting to live for myself, not for someone else's approval. I can't go back to being the man you wanted me to be." She nodded slowly, her face pale, as if his words were the final blow. "I understand," she whispered. "I really do. I just wanted you to know. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you." James nodded once, feeling the last remnants of their past slip away. "Goodbye, Emma." As he left the cafe, the cool evening air wrapped around him like a cloak, and for the first time in a long time, he felt free. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of excitement and new opportunities. James had made his decision. He had cut ties with the past, and the weight that had been on his shoulders for so long was finally beginning to lift. Emma's words, though filled with regret, no longer had the power to affect him. He was no longer the man who had needed her validation. He had built something on his own, a platform, a future, and most importantly, a renewed sense of self-worth. The new partnership with Lucas Green had opened doors that James hadn't imagined possible. The business was growing at a pace he hadn't anticipated, and with each new success, his confidence grew. Clients were signing on, and their platform was gaining traction in the marketplace. The road ahead was still full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, James felt equipped to face them. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, James stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, looking out at the city. The skyline sparkled under the night sky, a sea of lights reflecting the energy and ambition that thrived within the city's heart. It was a view he had never imagined he would have, not from the corner of his eye, but from the very center of the world he had once dreamed of conquering. "James." He turned around to see Kyle standing in the doorway, his familiar grin spread across his face. "We've got a call with a big investor in 20 minutes. Kyle said, his voice filled with excitement. "You ready?" James smiled, feeling the same spark of enthusiasm he had felt years ago, before everything had started to fall apart. But this time, it wasn't fear driving him. It was determination. "Let's do it," James replied, his voice steady. The call was smooth, and the investor, one of the largest tech firms in the world, was eager to invest in their platform. They signed the deal that night, and with it, James knew that his vision was no longer a distant dream. It was reality. He had done it. As he hung up the phone, Kyle clapped him on the back. "This is it, man. We're making history." James nodded, but his mind wasn't on the deal. It was on the journey, the long, grueling path that had brought him to this point. The sacrifices, the moments of doubt, the times he had almost given up. They had led him to this moment, to this victory. "Thanks, Kyle," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you." Kyle smiled. "We did it together." And as the night wore on, James realized that his journey was just beginning. This was only the first chapter of a much bigger story. The business, the success, the recognition, they were all important, but it was the man he had become that mattered most. He was no longer the man he had been when he walked away from Emma. He was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. He had found his purpose, not in the success of his business, but in the strength he had discovered within himself. James stood at the front of the office, overlooking his growing team. It had been months since the deal with Lucas had pushed their platform into the spotlight, and things were moving faster than he could have ever imagined. His office, once a quiet and humble space, was now filled with the energy of a thriving business. The team was working around the clock, each person motivated by the vision James had built from scratch. But there was still something in the back of his mind, a nagging question that refused to go away. Success had come, yes, but was it everything he had imagined? Could the accolades, the investments, and the growing influence be enough to fill the void left by Emma's absence in his life? The ringing of his phone broke his thoughts. It was an unknown number, but something inside told him to pick it up. When he answered, a familiar voice greeted him. "James." It was Emma. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly composed himself. "Emma, it's been a while." "I know," she said softly, the tension in her voice unmistakable. "I wanted to talk to you. Can we meet?" James glanced out the window, his mind racing. He had moved on, or so he thought, but there was still an unresolved chapter in his life, one that needed closure. He had built his life back from the ground up, but had he truly healed from the wounds she left behind? "Sure," James replied, keeping his voice neutral. "Where and when?" They arranged to meet at a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a place that had once been their spot, where they had spent lazy afternoons together. As he made his way there, James couldn't help but wonder what had prompted her to reach out after all this time. He had no illusions that this would change anything, but a part of him still needed to hear her side of things. When he arrived, he saw her sitting on a bench, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She looked almost the same, yet different, a little older, a little more worn, as if the life she had chosen for herself hadn't been as glamorous as it had appeared from the outside. "Hi," she said, standing as he approached. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Hi," he responded, not sure what to say. They stood there for a moment, the silence between them heavy, before she spoke again. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. I should have never treated you the way I did." James listened, but he didn't rush to speak. He had already made peace with their past. "It's in the past, Emma," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've moved on. I've built something for myself. And I'm happy." She looked at him, her eyes filled with regret. "I see that. I really do. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For how I acted. For the way I walked away. I was selfish." James nodded. but something inside him didn't feel the need to relive the past. He had been broken, yes, but now he was whole. She had played a role in his story, but she wasn't the one who would define how it ended. "I appreciate the apology," James said, his voice steady. "But I can't go back, Emma. I can't undo what happened. I've learned from it, but I've also moved past it." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand," she said quietly. "I just wanted you to know that I've changed, that I regret everything. And I'm sorry." James paused, then gave her a small, understanding smile. "I'm glad you've learned. We both have." With a final glance, he turned to leave. He didn't need to say anything more. He had found the closure he needed, not from her words, but from the way he had grown and moved forward without her. As he walked away, the weight of the past lifted completely. The city stretched out before him, bright with possibilities. He had found peace within himself, and that was all that mattered. The next few months were a whirlwind of momentum. James' startup was flourishing. His newfound confidence was contagious, and the business world had begun to take serious notice. Their platform was gaining traction, and the buzz surrounding it only seemed to grow. With every new contract, every successful pitch, the weight of past failures grew lighter. James had turned his life around, and the possibilities felt endless. But not everyone was thrilled by James' success. One morning, as James sat in his office, reviewing the latest round of investments, he received an email from a contact he hadn't heard from in years, Liam Hunter, an old competitor from the early days of his previous business. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." James furrowed his brow, uncertainty creeping into his chest. He hadn't spoken to Liam since the disastrous fallout with his first business, when the pressure of maintaining a top-tier tech startup had caused everything to implode. Back then, Liam had been a part of his inner circle, someone who had shared the same vision but left when the cracks began to show. His fingers hovered over the mouse, and for a brief moment, James hesitated. Should he open it? Should he even entertain whatever this message was about? He clicked. The email was short, almost cryptic. "I know what you're doing, James. Be careful. There are forces working behind the scenes that want to see you fail. It's not over." A chill ran down James' spine. Liam had always been an odd mix of sly and calculated, but this felt different. The message wasn't just a warning. It was a threat, veiled but clear. James immediately called Kyle into his office. "Hey, take a look at this," he said, forwarding the email. "Liam Hunter. He's warning me about something." Kyle read the email, his brows furrowing. "This is out of nowhere. You think it's real?" James leaned back in his chair, the weight of the words sinking in. "I don't know, but it feels serious." The rest of the day passed in a haze. James couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. He had worked so hard to get to this point, and now, just as things were finally falling into place, there was someone, or something, lurking in the shadows, threatening to destroy it all. Later that afternoon, the call came. It was from one of his top clients, a major player in the industry who had been using their platform to streamline operations. The client was vague at first, but it quickly became apparent that something wasn't right. "We've had a breach," the client said, his voice tight with concern. "Some of our data's been tampered with. We're looking into it, but we believe your platform might have been compromised." James' blood ran cold. A breach? His platform was secure. They had invested heavily in data protection, ensuring everything was locked down tight. But now, with the client's words hanging in the air, the possibility of sabotage suddenly seemed all too real. James hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had been warned. The message from Liam, the ominous email, suddenly made sense. There was a concerted effort to bring him down, to destroy the trust he had worked so hard to build. But by whom? And why now? He immediately called a meeting with his team. We need to go through every line of code, every system, and track down any sign of a breach, he instructed, his voice steady but urgent. I don't care how long it takes. We fix this, and we fix it fast. But as he looked around the room, James couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. This wasn't just about a technical issue. Someone was targeting him, targeting his success, and it was only a matter of time before they would strike again. The next few days were a blur of frantic activity. James and his team worked tirelessly, tracking every system, every line of code, trying to uncover any weakness in their platform. It wasn't just about fixing a breach anymore. The attack felt personal, deliberate. Someone was determined to see him fail. As the team dug deeper, they found no evidence of a direct hack. The systems were intact. The data hadn't been tampered with. But the unsettling feeling lingered. James couldn't shake the idea that the warning from Liam was more than just a coincidence. There was something larger at play, and someone powerful was behind it. Late one night, as he sat alone in his office, poring over logs, a thought struck him. Something he had overlooked earlier. What if the breach wasn't external? What if someone on the inside was orchestrating this? He quickly called Kyle. I need to meet with the team first thing in the morning, he said, his voice low. I think we might have an insider problem. The following day, the mood in the office was tense. James addressed the team, his eyes scanning their faces as he spoke. We've been looking at this all wrong, he began. What if this isn't some random attack? What if one of us is involved? The room fell silent. The idea of betrayal, of someone within their own ranks trying to sabotage them, was unsettling. But the more James thought about it, the more it made sense. There was too much at stake for someone not to try and bring them down. I've been going through some old files, he continued. We've had a few people leave recently, and there were a couple of employees who were acting strange before they left. I think it's time we looked into them. Kyle stepped forward, his expression serious. We need to be careful, James. Accusing someone without proof could ruin the company's reputation. I know, James replied, his jaw tight. But we can't afford to wait until it's too late. That afternoon, they began digging into the employees who had left under suspicious circumstances. It didn't take long before they stumbled upon something. One of the former employees, an ex-developer named Andrew, had been involved in a few questionable activities before he left. He had access to the platform's core files right before the attack occurred. James felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. That evening, he called the team together again. We're going after Andrew, he said, his voice firm. We need to find out what he knows, and if he's the one behind this. I don't care how we do it. We need answers. They spent the next few days tracking down Andrew's whereabouts. It wasn't easy. He had gone underground, deleted his social media profiles, and cut all ties with the company. But with the resources they had, they eventually found him living in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. James, Kyle, and a few trusted team members showed up at Andrew's door that evening. There was no turning back now. The door opened slowly, and Andrew's eyes went wide when he saw them standing there. He tried to back away, but they stepped inside. Andrew, James said, his voice cold. We need to talk. Andrew's face paled, and for a moment, he seemed to shrink under the intensity of James' gaze. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his hands shaking. James didn't wait for an explanation. "You've been sabotaging the platform," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I know you're behind the breach. And now, I'm going to make sure you pay for it." Andrew broke under the pressure, his resolve crumbling. "I didn't mean to. It was just for the money." The confession hit like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just a corporate sabotage, it was personal. Someone who had been a part of the team, someone James had trusted, had tried to destroy everything he had worked for. With Andrew's confession in hand, James turned to the team. "We take this to the authorities," he said, his voice steady. "This ends now." As they walked out of the apartment, the weight of the moment settled on James. He had been tested, pushed to his limits. But now, with the threat finally neutralized, he realized something. No matter how much the world tried to tear him down, he had the strength to stand tall. James stood at the window of his office, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the skyline. The last few days had been a whirlwind of decisions, from dealing with Andrew's betrayal to ensuring that everything was secured for the future. It had been a test of his leadership, his trust in his team, and his resilience. But as he stood there now, looking out over the city, he knew that he had passed the hardest tests. The relief was palpable, but so was the sadness. Andrew's betrayal had stung deeply. They had given him a chance, trusted him, and in return, he had tried to destroy everything they had worked for. It wasn't just about business. It was about loyalty, trust, and the people who had been part of his journey. James had learned the hard way that not everyone would walk beside you to the end. But there was another part of him, the part that had been slowly healing over time, that felt different now. He had taken back control of his life and his business, and with it came a new sense of clarity. It wasn't just about the success, the accolades, or the business deals. It was about reclaiming the person he had once been, someone with integrity, someone who wouldn't compromise his values. His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Emma. "James," it began, "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about, and I realized that I made a lot of mistakes. I hurt you, and for that, I am truly sorry. I've changed, and I hope you found peace." James stared at the screen, the words hanging in the air. Part of him felt angry, another part of him felt indifferent. She had apologized, but it didn't change the past. It didn't change how she had left him when he needed her most. A small sigh escaped him. He had forgiven her, in his own way. He had to. Holding on to resentment would only tie him to the past, to a version of himself that was no longer relevant. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean going back to what was. He typed a quick reply. "I've found peace, Emma. I hope you do too." He hit send and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the conversation sinking in. That chapter of his life, the one with all the pain, the regret, the broken dreams, was finally over. It had taken him a long time to get here, but he had made it. The scars would remain, but they were no longer defining him. He was more than that. He had rebuilt his life, piece by piece, and now he was stronger for it. Later that evening, as the office lights dimmed and his team began to head home, James took one last look around. The journey had been hard, but it had shaped him into someone capable of handling whatever came next. The work wasn't done, but the foundation was solid. The future, for once, felt like something he could control. And for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it, whatever it brought. James spent the next few weeks reflecting on how far he had come. The deal with Lucas Green had set them on the right path, and the team was now fully immersed in scaling the platform to meet the growing demand. The work was intense, but the satisfaction of progress was undeniable. Every new client was a reminder that their vision was no longer just an idea. It was a living, thriving entity. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a reflection of who he had become. But James knew the battle wasn't over. Success, especially the kind that came with the territory of his fast-paced startup, was fleeting. There were new challenges every day, new risks to take. Yet, as he sat in his office, looking at the horizon once again, he realized that for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had faced the hardest parts, the loss, the betrayal, the personal and professional failures, and he had come out on top. He wasn't the man he used to be, broken and lost. He was someone who had learned, adapted, and fought for his place in this world. And now, more than ever, he was ready for the next chapter. The next few months passed in a blur of meetings, conferences, and growing investments. Their platform continued to gain traction, and more investors were knocking at their door. James' reputation had solidified in the industry, and it wasn't just about the money anymore. He had become an example of resilience, a leader who had not only weathered the storm, but thrived in its aftermath. One evening, as James walked down the street, feeling the cool night air against his skin, he saw the city in a new light. The neon signs flickered above him, the hum of the busy streets, the laughter from nearby bars. All of it felt familiar, but somehow different. This was the same city he had fought to make his name in, the same city where he had once felt so lost. But now it felt like his. Not because of the money, not because of the success, but because he had found his peace. His phone buzzed. A message from Kyle. "We've got another round of funding. It's bigger than before. Let's get ready." James smiled. The work was never over, but that was what he wanted. The hustle, the drive, the endless pursuit of something greater. He had found his purpose, and it wasn't about pleasing others or proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. As he walked home that night, the city no longer felt like a battleground. It felt like home, and for the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. The success James had achieved felt like a dream. His company was flourishing, his reputation was intact, and his life, though still demanding, had finally gained a sense of stability. Yet, as he began to immerse himself deeper into the expansion of his business, a nagging thought lingered in the back of his mind. Something wasn't quite right. It all started when he received an anonymous tip about irregularities within his own company's operations. The message had been brief but clear. "There's a leak in the system. You're being watched." The words echoed in his mind, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. It could have been a random piece of misinformation, but something about it felt too deliberate. The hacker who had tried to sabotage his company months ago was behind bars. This couldn't be another breach, could it? James immediately instructed Kyle to run a full audit of all internal processes. They reviewed security protocols, checked for data leaks, and traced any unusual access to their sensitive information. The results were thorough but clean, and yet, the feeling of unease remained. Someone on the inside, someone close, could still be causing problems. As the days passed, more whispers began to surface. Rumors spread among the staff, strange occurrences in meetings, and quiet exchanges in hallways made James increasingly paranoid. Could one of his trusted employees be betraying him? Who in his team was in the shadows, quietly working against him? One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating meeting with a new group of potential investors, James received a call from his legal team. They had uncovered something disturbing. Financial discrepancies involving a key employee who had been siphoning money from the company's accounts for the past few months. The amount was substantial, enough to shake the very foundation of his business. His mind immediately turned to the people he had trusted the most, those closest to him. Who had betrayed him and why? He thought back to the earlier days of his startup, to the people who had stood by him, and to those who had left when things started to get tough. One name in particular came to mind: Nathan Walker, one of the founding members of the company who had taken a leave of absence several months ago. Nathan had been a part of the core team when everything was still just a dream. He was sharp, capable, and loyal, or so James had thought. But now, in light of the financial discrepancies, it seemed too much like a coincidence that Nathan had quietly stepped away just before the suspicious activities began. James didn't hesitate. He called a meeting with his senior staff, his eyes scanning the faces of those he had considered his trusted team. He needed answers. If Nathan was the one who had been playing him from the inside, he would not let it go unanswered. That evening, after a tense round of questioning, the truth emerged in a chilling revelation. Nathan had been the one orchestrating the sabotage from the very beginning. He had been siphoning funds, manipulating internal systems, and working with outside sources to undermine James' efforts. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the power he had wanted to reclaim. James stood there, in disbelief, as Nathan confessed. His heart raced, and his breath quickened. He had trusted him, a friend, a colleague, and Nathan had stabbed him in the back. Why? James finally asked, his voice rough. Why betray us like this? Nathan's face was pale, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I couldn't stand watching you succeed while I struggled, he muttered, barely meeting James' eyes. I wanted a piece of the pie, and I wasn't willing to wait anymore. The betrayal stung, deeper than any financial loss ever could. But this was something that James had never truly anticipated. The darkness that could fester within the people closest to you. James knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Nathan's actions ruin everything they had built. The trust in his company was fractured, but it could be repaired. It had to be. That night, after the authorities had been notified and the proper steps taken to recover the stolen funds, James stood at the edge of the rooftop, looking out at the city once more. He had faced betrayal, adversity, and doubt, but he had risen above it. He wasn't just a survivor. He was a fighter. And no matter how many times the world tried to tear him down, he was ready to face it all again. James thought the worst was behind him. After confronting Nathan and recovering the stolen funds, the company seemed to return to its steady growth. But success, as he was starting to realize, came with its own set of burdens. The price of climbing to the top wasn't just the work. It was the weight of the expectations that followed. The phone calls became more frequent. The meetings with potential investors, the demands from partners, the media requests, everything felt overwhelming. James had once thrived in this kind of high-pressure environment, but now, as his success continued to grow, the strain was starting to show. He barely had time for himself, and the quiet moments he used to treasure were now a distant memory. He had come so far, but at what cost? One afternoon, as James sat in his office, reviewing yet another stack of contracts, his thoughts drifted to something that had been gnawing at him for weeks. The more time he spent with his growing company, the more he realized that he had drifted away from the very reason he had started all of this in the first place. The passion, the purpose, the drive, they had been replaced by cold numbers, constant pressure, and endless meetings. As much as he loved the work, as much as he wanted the company to succeed, he knew deep down that he was losing himself in the process. He had become a symbol of success, a brand, a leader, but the man behind it all was slipping away, drowned in the demands of his new life. That evening, after another long day, James left the office earlier than usual. The streets of New York were bustling as always, but the noise felt distant. As he walked, he found himself heading to the park near his apartment, the same park where he had met Emma all those years ago. It was the place where he used to take walks to clear his mind, a place of peace before everything had become complicated. Sitting on a bench under the dim glow of a streetlight, James closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The cool air filled his lungs, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to just be still. It was a rare moment of clarity. "James!" The voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He turned to see Kyle standing nearby, a concerned expression on his face. "Hey, man," Kyle said, sitting down beside him. "You've been keeping to yourself lately. Everything okay?" James didn't answer right away. He could feel the weight of everything. The business, the betrayal, the endless responsibilities pressing down on him. It was all too much. "I don't know," James finally admitted. "I thought I was doing this for the right reasons, but now, it feels like I've lost sight of what I wanted. All of this," he gestured toward the city, "it's not what I thought it would be." Kyle nodded, his face serious. "Success doesn't always feel the way we expect it to. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the deals, but you've got to remember why you started in the first place. It's about the impact you're making, not just the title or the recognition." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I need to find balance. I can't keep going like this." Kyle gave him a reassuring smile. "You don't have to do it alone. We're a team, James. You've got people who care about you. Don't forget that." For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe he didn't need to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Maybe there was a way to find balance again, to reconnect with the passion that had started it all. As they sat in silence, watching the city come to life in the distance, James made a decision. It was time to take a step back, to find the balance he needed. He wasn't just going to be a businessman. He was going to be the person he had always wanted to be. Someone who could live with purpose, who could create something meaningful without losing himself in the process. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face the future, not with the weight of the past holding him down, but with a renewed sense of purpose and determination. James' decision to slow down and reconnect with his core values wasn't an easy one. The demands of the business didn't stop. There were always calls to be made, decisions to be taken, and deadlines to meet. But he made a conscious effort to carve out time for himself, to find the quiet moments that had once fueled his creativity and drive. However, just as he began to feel the relief of regaining control, a new challenge emerged. It came in the form of a competitor, one that had been quietly building a similar platform, one that seemed to have caught the attention of many of the investors and clients James had worked so hard to attract. Their product wasn't better, but it was new, and in the tech world, new often meant better. At first, James tried to ignore it. He was confident in his platform's capabilities, and the team was still moving forward, making improvements with every iteration. But the competitor's rise was undeniable. Headlines began to pop up, speaking of their success, their growing influence, and the partnerships they were forming. "Isn't this just the way it goes?" Kyle said one afternoon as they sat in James' office, going through new market research. "When you finally get your footing, someone else comes out of nowhere to make a play for the same space." James stared out the window at the city, trying to block out the creeping frustration. He had worked too hard, fought too much, to let some newcomer overshadow everything he had built. "They're not better," James said firmly. "They're just faster. They're playing the short game. We've been building something long-term. We've got the depth, the experience." Kyle nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "True. But sometimes the short game wins, especially when you're talking about investors and hype." James turned back to the desk, his mind racing. He could feel the pressure mounting once again. The anxiety that had crept into his life months ago was back, this time wearing a different face. It wasn't about his own insecurities anymore. It was about defending everything he had worked so hard for. He knew he needed to act quickly. They couldn't afford to lose their competitive edge, not now, not when they were so close to taking it all to the next level. That evening, James stayed late in his office, poring over the data, the contracts, and the roadmap for the company's future. There had to be something they were missing, something they could do to push the platform ahead of the competition. As the night wore on, an idea began to form in his mind, a way to take his company's offerings in a new direction, to innovate in a way that no one else had yet done. But it wouldn't be easy. It would require risk, a leap of faith, and a commitment to something bold. James pulled out his phone, dialing Kyle's number. "I've got it," James said as soon as Kyle picked up. "I know how we're going to beat them." Kyle was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm listening." "We're going to rebrand," James said, his voice steady with determination. "We're not just a platform for small businesses. We're going to revolutionize the way they operate. We're going to introduce AI integration that makes our platform smarter, more adaptive. We're going to make it so they don't just use us, they depend on us." Kyle's voice brightened. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. It's time for us to take the lead again. We won't just compete with them. We'll leave them in the dust." The idea ignited something inside James. He could feel the energy returning, the spark of the man who had once fought to get where he was. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about winning. He spent the next few weeks working tirelessly with his team, making adjustments, designing the new AI feature, and planning their market rollout. It wasn't just a new feature, it was a bold statement. A declaration that James wasn't just playing the game. He was changing it. As the product began to take shape, the first signs of success were evident. Investors were intrigued. Partners began to take notice, and the competition, once so sure of their success, started to falter. James knew that it wasn't enough just to have a good product. They needed the story, the vision, the momentum to back it up. He was ready to take the next step, and this time, he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. The moment of reckoning came faster than James had expected. Despite all his efforts, despite the tireless work his team had put in to rebrand and launch their new features, the competitor they had been fighting against wasn't backing down. In fact, they were now ramping up their efforts, pushing harder than ever before, and positioning themselves as the only real player in the game. They had the hype, the press, and the investors on their side, and it was beginning to feel like the world was leaning in their direction. James knew that the next move would be crucial. They had already set their sights on revolutionizing their platform with AI, but he realized that in order to truly win, they needed more than just a superior product. They needed to make their mark, to make the industry recognize them as the undeniable force in the field. It was time to make the big play. It was late one evening when the email came. A meeting had been scheduled with a major global corporation, a tech giant, one of the few players in the world that could either make or break their platform's success. The stakes were higher than ever. This was the deal that could elevate them to the next level, or it could be the end of the road. James and Kyle met the next morning to go over the details. They sat in the conference room, the weight of the upcoming meeting hanging in the air. "We need to go in with everything we've got," James said, his eyes sharp with determination. "This is our shot to show them that we're more than just a promising startup. We need to prove we're the future." Kyle nodded, his expression serious. "And if they don't buy it?" James paused. It was a thought that had crossed his mind, but he wasn't about to let it dictate the situation. "Then we keep fighting. But we won't stop until they see what we can do." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. James and his team spent the next few days finalizing their pitch, rehearsing every detail, every word. They knew that this meeting could define everything. It was the most important step they would ever take. When the day of the meeting arrived, James felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. They had worked so hard for this moment, and now it was time to put everything they had into play. He stood before the massive glass building, the reflection of the sun on the surface of the windows almost blinding. This was it. This was the test. Inside, the executives sat waiting, a group of serious, calculating faces, eyes cold and uninterested. They had heard pitches before, no doubt, and James knew they wouldn't be easily swayed. This wasn't going to be easy. As he stepped into the room, his voice calm but strong, James introduced his team and began the presentation. His slides were sharp, concise, but it wasn't the data that mattered most. It was the energy behind it, the passion he poured into every word, the fire in his eyes. He wasn't just selling a product. He was telling a story. He was showing them the future, one they couldn't ignore. For an hour, James spoke with fervor, outlining how their platform wasn't just a tool, but a revolution for the way businesses would function in the coming years. He walked them through the AI capabilities, the seamless integration, the data-backed results. As the meeting came to a close, the silence in the room was almost deafening. James felt the tension in the air, but he refused to show any signs of uncertainty. One of the executives, a woman with a sharp gaze and no-nonsense demeanor, stood up. "Impressive," she said, her voice steady. "We'll get back to you with our decision in the next few days. But I'll say this, your product is good. Very good. The market is clearly shifting, and your timing is excellent." James nodded, holding his composure. "Thank you for your time. We'll be waiting." As they left the room, Kyle clapped him on the back. "You nailed it, man. That went better than I expected." James smiled, but there was no time for celebration. The deal was far from done. He had felt the tension in the room, the way they were holding back, playing their cards close to the chest. But James knew something. He knew that if they didn't see the potential now, they would in time. Their platform was built for the future, and soon, the world would have to catch up. The next few days were a blur, the anticipation of the decision looming over him like a cloud. And then, just as James was beginning to doubt, the call came. The deal was sealed. They had won. James hung up the phone, the realization slowly sinking in. They had done it. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were shaping the future. But James knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The relief James felt after securing the deal with the tech giant was fleeting. The moment he stepped into the conference room with his team to celebrate, he was already thinking about the next challenge, the next step. Success was a fleeting concept. It could be here 1 minute and gone the next. It was the price of playing in the big leagues. As the weeks passed, the business grew faster than James had ever anticipated. The platform's AI features began to gain traction, drawing attention from not just clients, but industry leaders. Investors were knocking at the door, eager to be a part of the next big thing. But with the success came new challenges. The pressure of meeting expectations, keeping up with the growing demand, and managing the internal dynamics of the company weighed on him more than ever before. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the numbers on his screen, a realization struck him. His life had become a blur of endless meetings, phone calls, and constant work. The business had consumed him, and despite his success, something was missing. The man who had once started this venture with a vision of freedom, purpose, and personal fulfillment was now trapped in the very thing he had built. He had traded one set of chains for another. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had dreamed of building something bigger than himself, a company that could change the world. But now, the world he had built was suffocating him. It was hard to admit, but it was the truth. He had become a slave to the very thing he had fought so hard to create. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew he had to make a change. But what? How? The answer came, unexpectedly, in the form of a conversation with Kyle. They had been talking about the future of the platform, the next phase of growth, when Kyle mentioned something that struck a chord with James. "You know," Kyle said, looking over some financial reports, "we've built something incredible. But what if we took it a step further? What if we made this not just about business, but about giving back? What if we used our platform to help those who need it most?" The idea took root in James' mind like a seed. He had spent so long building a business that he had forgotten the larger purpose behind it all. It wasn't just about profits or recognition. It was about creating something that could truly make a difference in the world. For the first time in months, James felt a sense of clarity. He knew what he needed to do. The next few weeks were spent restructuring their strategy. The focus of the company would shift. They weren't just going to help small businesses grow. They were going to help communities, create opportunities for the underprivileged, and use their platform to drive real social change. It wasn't easy. There were challenges, pushback from investors who didn't understand the shift in focus, and difficult conversations with the board. But James was determined. He wasn't going to let his company become just another success story. It had to mean something more. And as the first community-based programs began to roll out, the response was overwhelming. Small businesses in underserved areas began using the platform to grow and reach new markets. Families were able to start their own businesses, and neighborhoods were revitalized in ways James had never imagined. The impact was immediate and tangible. For the first time, he felt the deep, personal fulfillment he had been missing. As the months passed, James found a new rhythm. He still worked hard, still fought to keep the business growing. But now it felt like he was fighting for something greater. The success of the company was important, but it was no longer the only thing that mattered. The real success, he realized, was the change they were creating in the world. The pressure never fully went away. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been. But James no longer felt trapped. He had found his balance. The balance between ambition and purpose, success and fulfillment. Looking out the window of his office at the city skyline, James finally felt like he had truly arrived. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a man with a mission. And the future, he knew, was just beginning. The city below buzzed with the energy of 1,000 dreams, each one pulsing with the ambition and determination of those trying to make their mark. For James, it was no longer just about competing in this high-stakes game. It was about legacy. It was about making sure that when he looked back on this time, He could see something that had meaning beyond the spreadsheets and deals. He sat in his office, surrounded by the team that had stood by him through every high and low. The office that had once been a symbol of his success, the glass walls, the sleek modern furniture, now felt like a tool for something much greater. They had built something from nothing, and now it was thriving, changing lives, and giving back in ways he had never imagined. The weight of the journey settled into his bones, but it was no longer a burden. It was a testament to everything he had overcome. Their community-driven projects had begun to spread beyond New York. James watched as small businesses in underserved regions grew, families achieved financial independence, and local economies started to turn around. The platform that had once been a tool for entrepreneurs now became a force for positive change. It was bigger than just profits. It was about giving people the power to build something meaningful. But it wasn't just the business that had transformed. James himself had changed. He had once been driven by the need for recognition, the desire to prove himself. Now, he was driven by the impact he could have, the difference he could make in the world. His life had become more than just a series of victories. It had become a story of redemption and purpose. As the company continued to grow, James found new ways to challenge himself. He started speaking at global forums, advocating for ethical business practices and social responsibility. He traveled the world, meeting with leaders, entrepreneurs, and activists, working to bridge the gap between business success and social impact. But despite all the accolades, James remained grounded. He never forgot the days when he had been unsure, when everything had seemed impossible. He kept close to the team, the people who had helped him rebuild, those who had believed in him when he could hardly believe in himself. They were his true success, the ones who had stuck with him through the darkest times. One evening, as he walked down the street, he paused at the entrance to the park where he had met Emma all those years ago. It seemed like a lifetime ago, the confusion, the heartbreak, the feeling of being lost. And yet, standing there now, he could see how far he had come. He had not only rebuilt his business, but had rebuilt himself. He had discovered what it truly meant to be successful, to be fulfilled. He looked up at the city skyline, its towering buildings shimmering in the soft glow of the setting sun. The future was wide open, and for the first time, James felt at peace with whatever it held. His journey had taken him to places he never expected, and though it had been difficult, it had been worth it. With a deep breath, he took a step forward, ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just living to survive anymore. He was living to thrive. The new dawn was here. James stood on a rooftop, the skyline of New York sprawling before him like an endless sea of possibility. The city that had once felt like a battleground, a place where every step was weighed down by the expectations of others, now felt like home. The wind ruffled his hair, and for the first time in years, he felt the warmth of the sun on his face. Not as a conqueror of others, but as a man who had finally conquered himself. The journey that had started with rejection, betrayal, and heartache had led him here, to this moment of quiet reflection. He had rebuilt more than just his company. He had rebuilt his soul, piece by piece, from the brokenness that had once defined him. The world had tried to break him, and it had succeeded, but only for a time. It was the hardest lessons that taught him the most, that true strength isn't found in what others see in you, but in what you find in yourself when the world turns its back. Looking out over the city, James realized that it wasn't the fame or the money that had mattered. It had never been about the success or the recognition. It had been about learning to stand on his own, to trust himself even when no one else did. The man he had been wasn't the man who stood here now. And that, more than anything, was the victory he had always craved. In the end, it was never about proving anything to anyone else. It was about proving something to himself, that no matter how many times life knocked him down, he could always rise again. He turned to walk back into the building, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The future was waiting, and this time, he was ready. The only thing that can truly break us is the belief that we are broken.